All right.
Okay.
Well, welcome to the redo of the seventh presentation on the Maryland campaign, and this focuses upon the aftermath and the implications of the battle, both domestically and internationally, actually. So, at the end of the day, on September 17th, 1862, Lee's drive north has been halted, and this is really, honestly, due to the course of two battles, one at South Mountain and then the pivotal one, the final one at Antietam on September 17th. Lee's position by this point is extremely precarious. He's suffered considerable casualties. His position at the end of the day is relatively strong considering everything. He's basically on a ridge line slightly to the west of Sharpsburg. I'm sorry, slightly to the east of Sharpsburg on elevated ground, facing the bulk of McClellan's army now getting ready to pass in front of him. More or less at this point, if McClellan is going to attack, it's going to be a frontal assault over a considerable distance uh, where Lee will enjoy good fields of fire. And by this point, he has the artillery that's available to him up on the heights. During the course of the day, Lee has been reinforced a few times by troops coming in from the Harper's Ferry area. And actually, McClellan has been enforced once lightly from troops coming in from the Harper's Ferry area. But at the end of the day, both armies are in a bit of a bind because during the course of two major engagements, one at South Mountain and the second at Antietam, they've managed to expend most of their ordnance, and they do not have enough ammunition at the end of the day, either of them, actually, to put up a considerable or extended fight. Both of them are going to have to resupply, especially when it comes to artillery, um, unless unless this comes to a mostly infantry fight, and even the infantry are running out of ammunition by this point. McClellan is triumphant. He's won basically twice, once at South Mountain and once at Antietam, but he's exhausted. And his casualties are high again, just as Lee's are. But McClellan can more afford the casualties than Lee can. McClellan doesn't have the same logistics issues that Lee does as far as being supplied overall, but in the very short term, he is pretty much in the same situation. He does not have enough ordnance to go around for his entire army. Again, the big difference between McClellan and Lee is that this is the worst supply situation at this moment that Lee is going to endure till at least 1864. Um, and as far as McClellan is concerned, the Army of the Potomac generally doesn't have an overall supply problem, but right now it doesn't have enough ordnance to keep going. It will get there. It's just a matter of how much time it will take. And the Army of Northern Virginia, again, is in a strong position at the end of the day, but it's only for the moment. The only reason this position is particularly strong at the moment is because both armies are tired, they're low on ammunition, and it's the end of the day. If this were a fresh day and the Army of the Potomac actually had its full supplies of ordnance, this would be a really precarious position for Lee because he's been backed up the course the entire day. His back is now to Sharpsburg. He's part of his army is pretty much within sight of the Potomac River. Most of his army is within a mile of the Potomac River, and it's at his back. So this is not a good place for Lee to be. Now, Lee is forced to retreat into Virginia. Um, he doesn't really have any options at this point. He can't get past McClellan, and there's no way past it. I mean, he basically has the only option he has. He could try to fight McClellan and push north again, but he even understands he doesn't have the ability to do that. Um, and the only other option he has is to cross the river into Shepherdstown and get back into Virginia and then reassess his options at that point. When Lee does that, there will be a short engagement at Shepherdstown the following days. There's not much of a battle, but the Army of the Potomac will follow slowly, but giving the Army of Northern Virginia time to start consolidating and reincorporating its stragglers. Now, if you'll go back to the first couple of presentations, one of the problems that the Army of Northern Virginia really has at Antietam is two things really. Number one, the Army is spread out, and it's really flung far afield, and getting it all back together and consolidating is going to be a problem. And number two, over the course of the past couple of weeks, the Army of Northern Virginia has incurred a lot of casualties, so to speak, by stragglers. About 6,000 stragglers are going to rejoin the Army of Northern Virginia in the weeks following, about the week or so following the Battle of Antietam. And if you recall earlier, too, one of the things I pointed out is Lee, in the aftermath of Antietam, when he's actually writing about the battle, is very, very frustrated about the numbers of stragglers in his army. Now, one of the big questions has always been, why does McClellan not pursue immediately? And the answer really is, in the short term, he doesn't really have the ability to. Part of the problem is he has to resupply before he goes across the river. It'll take him a few days at least to do that. His army has been seriously damaged at Antietam, and he just doesn't have the ability to run Lee's army down. Now, in the years after Antietam, especially considering that the vitriol between McClellan and Lincoln, and it's McClellan's other personality traits that really kind of condemn him, because people just assume that when McClellan doesn't follow up with an immediate hammer blows on Lee's army, that it's simply because he's just being McClellan. He always wants more men. He's always afraid that Lee has more men than he does. He's always a little bit slow to attack, but he wasn't at South Mountain. He wasn't at Antietam. And people just consider McClellan to be kind of ponderous and paranoid. And I think that that's really the reason he's been condemned so much in the assessment thereafter. Realistically, though, it's not a bad decision on McClellan's part. He doesn't really have the ability to do it with any degree of safety and security, at least not an aggressive pursuit. He understands pursuit. I mean, it's not that he doesn't. He's very well trained. He's a bright man. It's just that he doesn't really have the army's not really structured to do it. The only thing McClellan could do is keep running Lee down with his entire army and force another pitched battle or engagement. This is not the Napoleonic Wars, where McClellan or Lee, either one, has this enormous body of cavalry that is just waiting for the enemy to collapse and then be run down. All the cavalry in this war pretty much is going to be used for raiding and scouting, and it is used in pitched battles, but not very often. I mean, there are a handful of cavalry charges against the infantry during the American Civil War, and that sort of crushing pursuit is something that's really, really, honestly, kind of difficult to do. And again, the conditions aren't great for it either. Now, frustration. I think this is one of the most overlooked aspects of understanding what's going on in the Army of Northern Virginia after this battle. If you read some of what Lee writes, Lee is angry at his army. Lee is almost vapid over the fact that he has so many stragglers and so many men that that just aren't able to keep up. And again, I pointed this out earlier in the presentations that they can't. He's literally marching his army to death. They're marching too far. They're under-equipped. They're ill-equipped, and they simply don't have the stamina to do what Lee expects them to do. And this just has to do with human endurance. This isn't laziness. Many of these men are dropping out because they simply are exhausted. They don't, they're not properly fed. The rations in the Army of Northern Virginia are very poor at this time. They're not properly shod. This is a problem that we kind of come back to with the Army of Northern Virginia, but a lot of his men actually have footwear in very poor repair or no footwear at all. They're going to be like the Hood's brigade when Hood arrives at Antietam and he goes into battle on the first day. His men had just sat down to cook and eat for the first time in 3 days. This army is tired. Now it still puts up a tremendous fight at Antietam, but Lee is wearing his army out, and he just doesn't seem to understand, or maybe it's just a matter of his perception, that his army has just been pushed too far, and the reason he has 6,000 stragglers is partly due to the speed at which it's had to march and the poor state that the army is in, and honestly, the rather poor care that's given to the army. Not that Lee hasn't tried to resolve the logistics situation. He has, but he is still he doesn't seem cognizant of the fact, or he's rather just insensitive to the fact that the men can only go so far. Now, lack of an immediate pursuit of McClellan part allows Lee to recover. Um, and the relative safety of Virginia. Now, there's a small engagement shortly after Antietam, but it's nothing major, and Lee is able to disengage from McClellan and pull back to the interior of Virginia. Now, the real irony of this is shortly after Lee crosses back into Virginia, all of those supplies that he'd been requesting for months finally arrive. Between about the end of September, beginning of October, and the end of December of 1862 is probably the best supplied Lee's army will ever be in the entire war. Enormous amounts of supplies, literally just about everything from cattle to shoes to ammunition to uniforms. Everything is basically in abundance for about 2 months. Now, after the supplies start to arrive, and even beforehand, Lee is still considering a late invasion of the North. He doesn't do it, obviously. We have the record that he doesn't, but he's still pondering it. And it seems like up until maybe the first or second week of October, he's still possibly considering whether or not he might not go ahead and cross the Potomac again in 1862. Now, the last part again is kind of, maybe controversial to some people. And again, this isn't a attempt to tear Lee down. It's just kind of really having an honest look at it. And that is Lee simply just not understanding that his army is only capable of so much. Um, it it can only go so far, that the state of his soldiers is relatively poor, that his supply situation is pretty severe, and he still just doesn't understand, or he doesn't seem to understand, that these people have limits, and he's just pushed past them. And the writing, the tone of some of the writing, um, just seems almost oblivious to that fact. If it's not oblivious, then it's at least very insensitive. And he knows how bad his supply situation is. And obviously, perhaps in the day we don't understand um, things like nutrition and stamina quite as well as we do today, but it still should have been rather obvious to Lee that what he was asking was simply too much. And one has to wonder if the ghosts of 1861 and his rather disastrous campaign in Western Virginia weren't kind of haunting him, and he's worried about losing face again after South Mountain and Antietam. McClellan dithers. Now, again, McClellan's pretty good at dithering, but he did have legitimate reasons not to pursue Lee early on, just like Meade has a hard time pursuing Lee after Gettysburg. These are victories. Neither one of them is what you might refer to as a Pyrrhic victory, but the armies have limits, and and part of those limits are dictated by the casualties incurred during a battle. And McClellan, in the beginning, has a good reason, but as time passes, and there's still good weather left in 62, his dithering, not crossing into Virginia, becomes a little bit less understandable. To that effect, McClellan is going to be approached by Burnside. Burnside's not very happy about this. Burnside seems to have liked McClellan fairly well. He didn't want the job. He never wanted the job. And he basically objected to the job. But the only other option that when Burnside kind of objected to the job, they said, okay, we'll put Hooker in charge. And Burnside and Hooker hated each other. And once they threw out Hooker's name, Burnside said, okay, I'll do it. McClellan is bitter beyond reason. Now, again, getting into psychological evaluations of people who are long dead is always a dangerous business, but and we can ask whether it's narcissism or whether it's something else. But McClellan didn't reserve the vitriol when he was in charge of the Army of the Potomac with Lincoln as president, and he certainly unleashes it in volume after he's removed from command. One has to wonder whether it's personality issues or McClellan really just thinks that he is absolutely that good and everybody else is that much of an idiot. And, reading into it, who's guess? But McClellan is obviously somebody who is very, very impressed with himself, to say the least. It probably is some form of narcissism. But he becomes an even worse enemy to Lincoln after he departs company from the Army, and then, of course, is going to run against him in 64. Excuse me. Broader international consequences, um, I mean, I think, yes, got that out of order. I'm sorry. Here's the one. Okay. So the Emancipation Proclamation. With the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had written this prior to Antietam, but he needed a victory to issue this because you don't want to issue something like this from a position of weakness. You want to issue it from a position of strength, and it's going to change the war a lot after he issues it. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is not popular by far, even in the North. There are a lot of people who object to it. One of the primary objections is that many people in northern states are afraid that if the slaves are freed as a result of this war, one way or the other, that those slaves will then move north at the first opportunity and would be willing to work for lower wages than the white laborers. And that's actually what causes a lot of the stress. They're afraid that they're going to be replaced with cheap labor and they won't be able to get jobs. That's part of it. And that has political consequences, obviously, um, with the representatives of the population of the Union. Now, it's a carefully worded document and it has limited effects. And that's very important to understand. It's designed to not alienate border areas or loyal areas that maintain slaves. So it areas like Western Virginia, areas like Kentucky, Missouri, places like that tend to be excluded from this because these are this is aimed at those states in active rebellion against the United States. Now, and what Lincoln doesn't want to do is to aggravate slaveholders in loyal states or loyal areas and either make them neutral or push them over to the other side. So again, it's kind of carefully worded. Now, what it also does is it throws a gauntlet and sets a timer. That's kind of the way I explain the Emancipation Proclamation. It says, it basically says all the states that are in a state of rebellion, you have 90 days. You basically have until January 1st, 1863. If you stop fighting before January 1st, 1863, we will not touch your slaves. You can keep them. But if you're still fighting on January 1st, 1863, then at that point, all slaves in those states shall be considered free. Now, this fundamentally alters the course of the war. Up until this point, really the sole goal of this war was to preserve the Union. Now it's to preserve the Union and free the slaves. There are broad international consequences with this. Britain and France are opposed to slavery and have been enforcing a ban on the slave trade. Technically, slavery had been illegal in France since 1789. In 1833, with an asterisk, what I always tell people, Britain uses its entire budget for the year to buy the freedom of every slave in the British Empire. Now, some of those aren't freed until 1844, but the act still takes place. And there's a lot of moral outrage in Britain over slavery being allowed to continue. And one of the very first things that really sets the Confederacy in a tough place at the beginning of this war is the fact that the war is basically instituted to not only protect the institution of slavery, but by the verbiage of the people who are fighting it to spread it. And that is not a popular opinion in Britain and France. And Britain and France had actually been actively uh, patrolling the coast of Africa for basically decades by the American Civil War, trying to eliminate the last of the slave trade. And this is designed specifically to put a bigger wedge between the Confederacy and Britain and France in particular. Now, there had been problems from the beginning anyway. I mean, you know, it hadn't gone entirely smoothly between the Confederacy and Britain and France. One of the bigger criticisms and really more interesting things that kind of comes out of this is the Confederacy's diplomatic corps is really not very good. It tends to be rather, I guess, terse might be a good way to put it. A lot of the Confederate diplomats are rather inexperienced, and they don't have those longstanding relationships that the federal or Union diplomats have had for quite some time. And one of the other interesting things, if you read into this a little bit, they don't come across as quite as polished as the Union diplomats do. And adding to the issue where there already tension between Britain, France, and the Confederacy, like where Britain, or I'm sorry, the Confederacy withholds its cotton shipments in 1861. It does put Britain and France in a bit of a bind for a while until Britain just decides, yeah, we'll grow our own cotton in India and in Egypt and places like that. So, you've got a relationship on a bit of a downhill slide anyway, unless there's cash involved. And now you're really putting a further wedge and more distance between um, Britain and France in particular, and the Confederacy. Now, the war is going to drag on, and there's some really interesting things to consider toward the end of 1862. So we're in the last quarter of the year now, pretty much. The war is still not unpopular on either side yet. At this point, the war is there's still broad-based support for the war on both sides. For the Union, supplies are not a problem. Manpower is not a problem. But unpopularity will become an issue at one point. People will tire of this war dragging on, especially after 62, because one of the things we don't really take into account a lot of the time is that both Shiloh and Antietam in 1862 are great shocks to the American public on both sides of this conflict. Up until both of these battles, the number of casualties had been relatively low, not minimal by any means, but still within what you might consider the acceptable range. And then what you're going to see is at Antietam and Shiloh, you're going to set the pace or really set the standard for the battles for the remainder of this war. And these are going to be terribly ferocious, very bloody. And both of these battles come as a great shock to both sides. You consider the casualties of Antietam, over 23,000. And then you think that during the course of the American Revolution, there's only about 25,000 or so people killed during the course of 7 years of war. And in one day, you've got 23,000 casualties. You can see why this is a big shock to the public. Excuse me. For the Confederacy, supplies are already a problem. Now, this dates back to really, honestly, the beginning. There's a lot of underlying stuff here. Number one, the Confederacy doesn't have a tremendous amount of industry. Number two, withholding those cotton shipments in 61 denied them a lot of cash that they really could have used because they thought that they were going to blackmail France and Britain into recognition by withholding the cotton. That didn't work. And then they don't get the money out of that. The cotton basically, goes to no good use. And that also puts a further strain in the relationship between the Confederacy and France and Britain in particular. Manpower is already becoming a problem with the Confederacy by the fall of 1862. The Confederate government is the first government in the history of the United States to actually institute a draft because by late 62, you're starting to see people just not volunteering. And interestingly enough, that draft is going to lead to some of the problems, which are far more complex and really deserve a program of their own, um, of how the war becomes unpopular in the South. For instance, plantations or that have a large amount of slaves are allowed to keep a number of men on the plantation or on the farm, wherever, in order to quote unquote manage the slave population, which means that one of the things that's going to happen after this draft is that a lot of the well to do white Southerners are going to maintain a significant number of their male population, the male, their brothers, cousins, etc., at home, whereas the mass of the Southern population, about 75%, that doesn't own any slaves, that will then be susceptible to the draft and doesn't have that sort of deferment, so to speak, to the draft, and that's going to cause some of the tension there too. And unpopularity, again, is going to become a problem in the Confederacy. Now, a little bit different reasons sometimes, but really, honestly, on both sides, one of the big issues is just fatigue. By 1863, especially toward the end, even after you've got big federal victories at Antietam and Gettysburg, with some big Confederate victories in between, both sides are just starting to tire by 1863. Both sides went into this thing it was going to be a quick war, and it's not. So the clock's ticking for both sides in different ways. Lee fights on. Lee's going to have about 3 months, October, November, and part of December, of relatively relaxed operations. And what Lee is going to do is spread his army from Richmond all the way to the Valley. And he's going to have pieces kind of everywhere. Now, it can be consolidated in a reasonably short amount of time, but not, instantaneously. However, Lee judges his enemy right, at least in the beginning, and has that window of October and November with a little action, but not terribly much, where his army can rest and recuperate. Again, the supply situation is resolved. Lee's starting to get replacements for reinforcements. And for about 60 days or so, he's going to have a good chance to, reorganize, reorient, retrain, and consider his options. Burnside is under a tremendous amount of pressure to move against Lee from the very beginning. Lincoln is obviously fired McClellan because he's upset over the fact that McClellan didn't pursue Lee, didn't make much of an effort to cross the river, at least in force, and pursue the war in Virginia again. And this is something that Burnside knows he's going to have to do from the very beginning. Now, Burnside is a reluctant leader. He's a very bright guy. He's a mechanical engineer. He is an inventor. He develops his own carbine called the Burnside carbine, which is going to go through 5 different variations during the course of the war, be adopted by the Union Army. It's just that he really feels like he's out of his league. He's commanded a large number of troops before, and he's done okay, but he really thinks it's just beyond his ability. Maybe it is, but he comes up with a good idea. It's not that Burnside's idea to attack Lee is bad. It's that it's complicated and that there's going to be a lot of problems with communications and making this operation that's going to result in the Battle of Fredericksburg work. And, we don't want to get too much to counterfactual history, and Fredericksburg is going to be my next series for TDI, and then my battlefield tour next year at the conference. But you sit and you look at this on paper and you consider the possibilities, and what it really comes down to is Burnside comes up with a good idea, but it doesn't work. And how many times in military history have you heard of that? And this lapse, this time off here is going to end up leading to the battle at Fredericksburg in December, which is going to be another tremendously bloody fight, and one that starts to really begin to make the war start to become unpopular in the North. At Fredericksburg is where you can start to see some of those initial cracks forming in the aftermath of that battle, with some uh, with some distaste for the war and wanting the war to kind of come to an end. It's not as bad as it will get. It will get worse, but Fredericksburg seems to be really the starting point for that. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry if you hear me sniffing every once in a while, but I'm sick again.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Slaughter. That was very informative. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Chris. You're muted.
Usually I don't mute. Um, all right. Um, any questions?
Not for me.
Okay, well, I got one. I'll throw it out there. This is kind of a big picture one.
Okay.
Was fundamentally the Maryland campaign a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, it wasn't a bad idea, um, but Lee is always accredited for being a very audacious commander. I agree with that statement. I mean, he does try to invade the North twice. If you look at what he tries to do in Western Virginia in 61, it's audacity, but it's also, in all three instances, West Virginia 60, Western Virginia, eventually West Virginia, 61, Maryland 62, and Pennsylvania, the invasion of Pennsylvania 63, which he actually gets into Pennsylvania, they all get turned back. The other and there's some other underlying issues with this. There was some genuine discontent in the Confederate Army with invading the North. It's not. I don't want to overstate it and all, because I don't think it's, obviously the Army follows Lee. It's not that bad, but there was some discontent with invading the North. Number two, Lee had better results fighting inside of Virginia and actually, picking the place of his own choosing, where at South Mountain's not of his own choosing. Antietam is definitely not of his own choosing. And, you've got to ask, considering the tremendous population of the North, with all of its resources and, you know, including lots of militia, lots of units that are not basically doing anything, actively in places like Pennsylvania, New York, et cetera, whether or not this really had any genuine chance of succeeding or not. And I think that really is the question. Does either invasion, 62 or 63, really have a chance to do what Lee wants to do with it? And my best answer is I don't know that either one of them did. And the reason being is because the amount of power the Union could consolidate over a reasonably short amount of time seems almost insurmountable. And in either of these events, everything would have had to have basically gone absolutely perfect for Lee. And another thing that I don't think that was really considered very well is that I don't think Lincoln ever had any intention of stopping to fight this war. I don't think he would ever have stopped fighting this war. And I think that the contention that just defeating the Union Army, the Army of Potomac, one time decisively somewhere in federal territory would have led to a general ceasefire is pretty pretentious. And I think what we've gotten in the habit of doing with all of our counterfactual examinations of especially the Civil War, especially with all the emotions that go with that and the lost cause mythology and all of the problems that's generated, is we've tended to somehow suggests that if Lee had just won at Antietam or just won at Gettysburg, the South would have won the war. And I don't think that's the case at all. Matter of fact, I don't see any information that without a series of absolutely crushing blows and then going even beyond occupying Washington D.C. that this ever would have happened. And I don't think the resources are there to do it. If the Confederacy had stuck to its interior lines and made those really um, painful, decisive defensive battles even worse over a longer period of time, it would have husbanded the resources better, and especially manpower, which, I mean, Antietam and South Mountain and Gettysburg are going to be really hard on Lee's manpower. And arguably, if they could have stretched the war out longer and had more of that power available to resist Grant and Sherman, that might have ended up uh, creating a situation where the North became tired of the war or McClellan got elected. But I don't think either of these invasions had any real chance, especially in 62 with Lee's supply situation, his personnel problem, of ever creating an environment where the Union would want to quit.
Okay. Other questions?
I have one question. Excuse me. I'll do the camera. Um, is there any chance that forcing an evacuation of Washington could have had positive political and international consequences for the South?
Oh, I mean, I think if you could have forced Washington to be evacuated, of course, it's embarrassing, but it doesn't stop the war. What happens? You just move the government. It didn't stop the war in 1812. It didn't stop the war for the Confederacy after Richmond falls to Grant. That it. I think again, this sort of Napoleonic mindset. Oh, if I just take their capital, everything will be better. Even falls short because when you take Moscow, what happens to Napoleon's army? You know, there's no guarantee of this. Um, and I think Lincoln, when Lincoln puts Grant in charge, and Lincoln finally gets the guy he wants, which is the guy who's just going to go after Lee's army. That is what's required to win this war, is really destruction of the enemy army. And I don't see at any one point, especially in 62, that Lee had any chance to completely and decisively destroy the Army of the Potomac. I don't think that was really achievable. At Chancellorsville, it's probably his best shot to do something like that. That is not, Chancellorsville is not a total, uh, final and utter rout of the army where it's absolutely destroyed. It doesn't happen. Um, it doesn't happen at Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, obviously, Lee loses. I just think that Lee wants to attack, and certainly there's an argument that that's how you win, but that is how you win a war. But we get down to when we start really digging into this, does the Confederacy ever have a real chance or the real option, the personnel, the supplies, etc., to win an offensive war against the Union? I think the answer is absolutely no. The only chance they really have to win this war is to drag it out and make it painful and make the Union want to quit. And in both instances, I think looking at Maryland in 62 and then the Gettysburg campaign in 63, retrospectively, of course, we can say, well, obviously they lost, but in either of these, with either of these campaigns, I don't think they really had the ability to do what they wanted to do, which is force the North to quit the war, simply because they just didn't have the ability to destroy all of the federal forces north of the line where it would have made a difference. And would have evacuating Washington have had that much of an effect on the war? No, I don't think it would have. They would have just moved the government and fought on. Baltimore, Boston, New York, Harrisburg, someplace else.
All right. Other questions? Well, thanks for coming by, people. We are going to go ahead and stop the recording now.